Have you ever been on a peaceful flight and then, in a split second, were forced to choose between staying quiet to preserve the peace or standing up to maintain your dignity? One seemingly normal morning, a quiet black woman was asked to change seats right on the plane that she was the real owner of. In that moment, how do you think she should have reacted, angry or smiled, and let the truth speak for itself if it were you, when you were judged only by the color of your skin, by your simple appearance? What would you do? Would you choose to speak up, or silently endure like so many times before? There are times when a person's life is wrapped up in a few seconds of choice, and at that very moment, a person reveals all the strength within themselves. Today's story will make you wonder, where does a person's true value lie, and what happens when the truth can no longer be hidden? We invite you to join us on this emotional journey. If you find these values worth spreading, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any heart-touching stories. The morning air at a Monument Gate private terminal carried a thin veil of cold, the kind that hovered just above the skin like a whisper. Denver always had a particular way of starting the day: quiet, measured, almost cautious, like it wanted to make sure everyone was awake before the sun committed to rising. The runway lights blinked in the distance, cutting through the bluish-gray dawn. And there, at the entrance of the glass-walled terminal, stood a woman wrapped in a soft heather-gray hoodie, navy leggings, and worn-in running shoes. She held a stainless steel tumbler in one hand and a slim laptop backpack in the other. Nothing about her shouted attention. She didn't wear luxury brands. She didn't walk like someone expecting greetings or bows, but if anyone had looked a little closer, they might have noticed the steadiness in her posture, the quiet focus in her eyes, and the way she paused to take in the room, not out of insecurity, but out of habit. Her name was Amara Sterling, and she owned the jet sitting outside on the tarmac. She stepped toward the reception counter, her shoes silent against the polished floor. A young attendant, distracted by a tablet, looked up with polite uncertainty. "Good morning," Amara said, offering a small smile. Her voice was soft but unmistakably steady. "Checking in for the Aurora LX 900 flight to Seattle." The attendant blinked, searching the passenger list. Then his brow furrowed. His polite uncertainty shifted into something more awkward, something Amara had seen many times before. Ma'am, are you sure you're on that flight?" he asked carefully. He wasn't rude, just unsure. Overly unsure. Amara's smile didn't falter. It rarely did. "Yes," she replied, "I'm quite sure." He hesitated again, scanning the digital tablet one more time, as though hoping a different angle might make the answer clearer. Amara didn't say anything else. She simply waited. Still. Calm. She'd learned a long time ago that stillness often revealed more about people than talking ever could. A few feet behind her, the glass doors slid open with a sharp hiss. A voice, loud, bright, dripping with practiced confidence, filled the room. "Victor, honestly, if they keep this place any colder, they might as well store meat in here." A woman in her late 50s strode in, heels clicking hard enough to echo, a long camel coat draped over her shoulders like a cape. Her hair was perfectly curled, and diamonds glittered at her wrists as if they demanded attention. Trailing just half a step behind was her husband, tall, well-fed, and holding his phone at a distance that suggested his call was meant to be heard by anyone within 20 feet. Yeah, 120 million for the initial phase." He barked into the phone. "And that's just the starting number. They need us more than we need them." The older couple's presence shifted the air, filling the quiet room with a hum of loud importance. Amara didn't turn around. She didn't need to. The attendant's posture straightened instantly, the way people do when money walks into a room wearing perfume. The woman, Elaine Hawthorne, gave a cursory glance around the terminal, her gaze sweeping past the attendant, past the coffee machine, past Amara. Then her attention snapped back to Amara. Not in recognition, in assessment. Elaine eyed the hoodie, the leggings, the plain tumbler. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She leaned toward her husband, whispering loud enough for 3 rows of seats to hear. Looks like they're letting just anyone fly private these days. Victor grunted, too engrossed in his call to look up, and still, Amara didn't turn. She took a quiet sip from her tumbler, her mother's blend, cinnamon sweet and earthy, letting the warmth settle inside her chest. There was a time, years ago, when comments like that knotted her stomach, when she felt the urge to justify herself to reassure strangers who had already decided her worth. But she wasn't that woman anymore. A low, mechanical hum sounded from the far corner. The door to the staff hallway opened, and a man in uniform stepped out, broad-shouldered, clean-cut, wearing aviator sunglasses even though they were indoors. Captain Bryce Harrington? He moved like someone permanently inconvenienced by the existence of other people. He skimmed the room, saw Elaine and Victor, gave them a nod of acknowledgement, almost respect. Then his eyes landed too briefly on Amara. A flicker of something passed across his face. Dismissal, maybe irritation, a kind of quiet judgment he'd perfected over years of assuming authority. Amara felt it, like a shift in air pressure. But she didn't move. Bryce approached the counter, glancing at the attendant's screen. Status, he asked. Passengers arriving now? Captain. Final check's done. Bryce nodded. Good. I want the VIPs boarded first. No exceptions. The attendant glanced at Amara again, nervous, embarrassed, but Bryce had already turned away. Elaine seemed delighted by the comment. Victor finally hung up his call and strode over, shaking Bryce's hand like they were closing a deal. Morning, Captain. Victor boomed. Hope my seat's set up the way I requested. All taken care of, sir. Bryce replied smoothly. Everything is prepared for your comfort. Elaine stepped closer, arms crossed, her coat swishing softly. Lovely, and as it should be. She glanced sideways at Amara again, as though Amara was a question no one had answered. A soft voice chimed from the hallway. A woman in a Navy uniform appeared, Maria Evans, the flight attendant. Young, bright-eyed, but carrying a strain of worry that settled in the corners of her expression. Morning, everyone, Maria said. We'll be ready to board shortly. Her gaze drifted to Amara only for a split second, but in that instant, something uncertain flickered in her eyes. She looked as though she wanted to smile, but wasn't sure if she was supposed to. Amara offered her a gentle nod. Maria's shoulders loosened just a little. Outside the window, the Aurora LX 900 gleamed under the pale morning light. Sleek lines, carbon fiber wings, and the signature sterling silver stripe that wrapped around the fuselage. It was the newest model in Aurora Air's private fleet, quiet, efficient, and designed for long-range comfort. Amara had personally overseen its cabin redesign months earlier. She knew every contour, every stitch, every line of recessed lighting along the aisle. And today, she would see how the people running her company treated someone they assumed held no power. As the boarding announcement echoed softly through the terminal, Amara exhaled a slow, measured breath. Another day, another test. Another room where people would reveal themselves before they even knew who she was. The attendant finally returned her boarding pass, no longer questioning, but still uncertain. Enjoy your flight, ma'am, he said quietly. She nodded, tucked the pass into her pocket, and walked toward the gate toward the jet she owned, the cabin she designed, and the world that still, after all these years, struggled to see past her skin. But Amara walked with calm, with resolve, with the quiet strength of someone who had already weathered storms much harsher than a cold morning in Denver. Behind her, she heard Elaine whisper sharply, well, this should be interesting, and it would be more than any of them could imagine. Boarding began with that familiar quiet rustle of movement, the kind that fills private terminals without ever rising above a murmur. The walkway to the jet shimmered slightly through the glass. Soft morning light brushed over the polished aluminum, making the aircraft appear almost otherworldly. Maria Evans walked ahead, directing passengers with an encouraging smile. Yet beneath that smile lived a careful tension. Her steps were light but deliberate, as though she feared one misstep could send the morning spiraling again. She had worked with Captain Bryce Harrington long enough to understand his moods, and today there was a sharpness in his presence she hoped would dull once they were airborne. As Amara Sterling approached the boarding door, she slowed, not intentionally, simply because something inside her tugged. A familiar quiet pause before entering a space where she would be judged before she even sat down. She let the moment pass through her, then offered Maria a small nod. "Good morning, Ms. Sterling," Maria said with a soft breath, as though relieved to greet at least one peaceful soul today. "We have refreshments available once you are settled." "Thank you," Amara replied gently. Inside the cabin, cool air washed through the space in subtle patterns. Soft white lighting framed the aisle. Leather seats shaped to the body invited rest. Every detail was something Amara had once approved in a long conference room meeting. She had argued for comfort over extravagance, warmth instead of cold luxury. She wanted travelers to feel held, not displayed. And yet, she knew none of that mattered if the people running this space failed at something far more basic: respect. Behind her, the voices of Victor and Elaine Hawthorne entered the cabin like a gust of wind that refused to settle. Their shoes, their tone, even the cadence of their breathing carried an expectation that the world bend to meet them. Elaine stepped past Amara without acknowledgement, leaving behind a faint perfume trail that clung to the air. Victor brushed by too, not unkindly, but entirely unaware of the space others occupied. His energy filled the aisle as if he owned it. Maria guided Amara towards seat 1C, a comfortable single seat near the front. Amara placed her backpack beside her, took another slow sip of her drink, and let her mind ease into the steady rhythm she practiced whenever she traveled alone. But as soon as she settled, she sensed a shift behind her, a flicker of disapproval, a vibration of displeasure that seemed to radiate outward like heat. Elaine had stopped walking. Her heels clicked once against the floor. Then silence. "Maria," Elaine said sharply. "Why is she sitting there?" Maria froze. Her fingers curled slightly against the tablet she carried. "I am sorry. Mrs. Hawthorne, this is Ms. Sterling's assigned seat." Assigned. Elaine repeated the word like it tasted wrong. "That seat is designed for quiet work? For privacy?" "You know that. Victor and I always request it. Always. We have an important negotiation today, and we cannot sit side by side. You know that too." Her tone carried years of practiced authority, the kind built not on kindness, but on habit. A habit of having doors open and options rearranged. Maria swallowed before answering. "Your preferred seats are prepared for you, Mrs. Hawthorne, just behind this row." Elaine inhaled, a long, controlled breath that sounded like she was preparing to scold someone. She looked at Amara, studying her with a growing frustration, as if Amara's presence itself disrupted the order of things. "Is there a mistake in the manifest?" Elaine asked, turning toward Maria again. "Or is there some last-minute override I was not informed about?" Before Maria could respond, Captain Bryce Harrington stepped into the cabin. His posture straight and his expression carved from the same stone-like confidence he always wore. He scanned the room quickly, noticing the tension, noticing who stood where, and then he saw Amara. His gaze lingered only a second, but it carried meaning, the kind that tried to place someone in the hierarchy of the world he believed he commanded. His expression tightened. "Captain Harrington," Elaine began, relief washing over her features. "I need your help. There is a seating issue." "A seating issue," Bryce repeated, stepping closer. "What kind of issue?" Elaine gestured toward Amara with a slight tilt of her hand, almost gentle, though the intention behind it was sharp. This passenger is in my regular seat, the one we use for business travel. I am sure it is a simple oversight, but I would like it corrected before we depart." Amara remained quiet. Still, she did not lift her head fully, only looked at Captain Harrington through a calm, steady gaze. She had no desire to escalate anything, yet she also had no intention of moving. Maria spoke before anyone else could. "Ms. Sterling is in her assigned seat. Captain. Everything matches the manifest." Bryce barely glanced at Maria. His eyes stayed locked on Amara. Something inside him bristled. "Ms. Sterling," he said, his voice low and firm. "Would you mind relocating to one of the lounge seats in the rear cabin? It would help maintain balance and comfort for everyone." Balance? Comfort. Amara repeated the words silently. They were the polite mask often placed over something far less polite. She met his gaze without raising her voice. "Captain, my seat is here. A simple sentence, no argument, no apology, just truth." Bryce exhaled through his nose, a slow flare that held impatience. "Maria," he said, "turn on the auxiliary lights and give us a moment." Maria hesitated, clearly caught between protocol and fear. Bryce's expression hardened. "Now." She stepped away reluctantly. Elaine folded her arms, her diamond bracelets chiming faintly. She appeared satisfied that authority had arrived to restore what she believed was the natural order. Victor sat down behind them with a sigh, rubbing his temples as though inconvenience itself offended him. Amara remained still, a calm center inside a tightening circle. Captain Harrington leaned in slightly. "Ms. Sterling. Some seating arrangements are meant for returning clients who have distinct requirements. I am trying to prevent complications during flight." "Complications?" Amara murmured softly. "From me." Her tone was quiet, not accusatory, not emotional, just clear. A clarity that made Bryce pause. He straightened, jaw tightening. "I am asking you to move," he said, voice firm, as though final. The cabin fell into a stillness so deep it felt like the air itself held its breath. Amara placed her tumbler on the side tray. She folded her hands gently in her lap. "No, Captain. I will not move." Those simple words shifted the room. Elaine's eyes widened with disbelief. Victor muttered something under his breath. Maria watched from the galley, fear tightening her shoulders. Bryce's face darkened. He wasn't used to resistance, and certainly not from someone he had already judged as inconsequential. "Ms. Sterling," he said slowly, "you are interfering with the operation of this flight." Amara's pulse remained steady, almost serene. Years of boardrooms where people assumed she was the assistant, not the decision-maker, had trained her well. "I am sitting in the seat I was assigned. That is not interference." Bryce took a breath that sounded like frustration wrapped in authority. "Then I will need to speak with ground security before we proceed." Elaine looked pleased. Maria looked horrified, and Amara simply nodded once. "Do what you believe you must, Captain." The moment stretched, thick, heavy, unresolved. The storm had not broken yet, but everyone felt the air change. And for the first time that morning, Bryce Harrington realized this quiet woman in a simple hoodie did not fear him at all. He did not yet understand why, but he would, very soon. The terminal doors had fully closed when the sound of Bryce's footsteps faded down the narrow aisle toward the exit. His departure left the cabin in a suspended hush, as if the aircraft itself waited to see what would happen next. Maria stood near the galley, fingers brushing nervously across the edge of a folded safety card. She looked like someone trying to steady herself on shifting ground. Her gaze flickered between Amara and the empty doorway where Bryce had disappeared. A question trembled at the back of her eyes, yet she did not speak it. Elaine eased herself into her seat with the poise of someone arranging an invisible crown. She exhaled loudly enough to signal her displeasure to anyone who cared to notice. Her coat settled around her shoulders like a curtain, closing on a performance she believed should not have been interrupted. Honestly, Victor, she muttered, how does something so simple turn into a whole production? Victor sighed in agreement. He was scrolling through a contract on his phone, the glow illuminating his face in cool tones. His shoulders were still stiff from annoyance, the kind of stiffness that came from believing inconveniences were personal offenses rather than inevitable parts of life. The problem, Elaine continued, tapping one manicured finger against her armrest, is that she simply does not understand how these things work. A word often thrown with a casual flick that could wound deeper than any insult spoken outright. Her eyes wandered briefly to Amara, not in curiosity, not in interest, but in a quiet confusion that bordered on irritation. Amara remained still in seat 1C, her breathing even, her expression unreadable. She had learned long ago that silence could be its own strength. People revealed themselves most clearly when they filled the quiet with assumptions. She kept her hands folded gently, letting the warm scent of cinnamon from her tumbler linger near her. It reminded her of mornings when her mother stood at the kitchen counter, stirring a pot on the stove with slow, rhythmic movements, when the world had felt small enough to understand and safe enough to trust. Now, sitting in a cabin filled with polished surfaces and worried glances, Amara carried that memory like an anchor. Maria took a hesitant step toward her. Ms. Sterling. Her voice was soft, uncertain, almost apologetic. Can I get you anything before we continue? Amara lifted her eyes. For a moment, the tension in the young woman's features softened as their gazes met. I'm all right, thank you. Amara answered gently. Maria nodded, though the worry remained. She busied herself with the tray, though her hands moved without purpose. She kept glancing toward the door, as though hoping Captain Harrington would return calmer, more reasonable. Part of her wished the morning might settle like a shaken glass returning to stillness. But the room held a different truth. Elaine's voice drifted forward again. Maria, she called, her tone syrupy sweet in the way people become when they expect compliance as naturally as breath. When will we be departing? My husband and I have a meeting we cannot miss. Maria swallowed before answering. The captain stepped out to speak with the ground personnel. Mrs. Hawthorne. We should have an update shortly. Elaine's lips tightened. Why is he even dealing with this? A simple seat swap should not require such formality. Victor finally looked up from his screen. Elaine, let it go. He rubbed his forehead. The man is doing his job. But Elaine was not a woman who let things go. She was a woman who filed away every slight, real or imagined, as if building a case she never stopped preparing. Well, it certainly is affecting our schedule, she replied sharply. Her gaze drifted back to Amara, not confrontational this time. More curious, as though she could not understand why this particular woman would not simply step aside. For years, Amara had lived with that look. It followed her in boardrooms, in restaurants, in hotel lobbies. The unspoken question behind it always the same. Who do you think you are to take up this space? Her answer, though rarely spoken aloud, never changed. Someone who earned it? Someone who would not surrender it. The cabin door opened with a soft hiss. All eyes turned. Bryce returned alone. His expression was unreadable yet tight around the edges. He straightened his uniform with two sharp tugs before stepping further inside. We are sorting out the matter, he announced. We will depart shortly. His posture radiated impatience, the kind he didn't bother to hide. Elaine looked relieved. Victor resumed typing. Maria exhaled but kept her stance careful. Captain Harrington moved toward the cockpit but paused when he reached Amara. Something in him couldn't resist one more attempt to assert himself. His shadow fell partially across her seat. Ms. Sterling, he said. Once again, I urge you to consider relocating. It would make things easier for everyone. Amara met his gaze calmly. Captain, my seat is here. The firmness in her tone was unshakable. It held centuries of resilience, decades of discipline, and years of climbing ladders others tried to remove rungs from. Bryce inhaled slowly. Years of military authority crackled at the edges of his restraint. Then, with a clipped nod, he stepped away and continued forward. The cockpit door shut behind him. Silence returned, though heavier, as if the air thickened in anticipation of what would come next. Maria approached gently, though her voice carried the tremor of someone caught in a crossfire. I'm sorry, she whispered near Amara. I wish this morning had gone differently. Amara turned her head slightly, her expression kind. It's not your fault. Maria blinked. No one had said her name with that kind of softness in weeks. It reminded her of when she first joined Aurora Air, filled with hope and belief in the service she would provide. Before she learned how hierarchy sometimes overshadowed compassion, she took a breath and steadied herself. If you need anything, please tell me. I will, Amara replied. Maria returned to her station, carrying a quiet determination she had not felt at the start of the day. Something in Amara's calm steadiness had anchored her, even though the storm had not passed. Elaine shifted in her seat again, glancing at Amara as though waiting for her to reveal some vulnerability. Yet all she saw was composure so effortless it felt unreal. I still don't understand it, Elaine murmured to her husband. Why someone like her would insist on staying there? Victor did not look up from his device. Some people are stubborn, he said distractedly. Leave it alone, Elaine. But she could not. She watched Amara with a puzzled intensity, unable to reconcile the simplicity of her clothing with the quiet strength in her posture. People often underestimate what they cannot categorize, and Amara had grown accustomed to living outside the categories people tried to fit her into. Minutes passed, quiet moments filled with subtle glances, hushed breaths, and the distant hum of engines warming outside. Then the intercom sounded. This is Captain Harrington. We will begin final preparations for departure, so please remain seated. The tone of his voice carried something new. Not resolve, not calm. Something closer to irritation forced into formality. The morning was shifting again. No one yet understood how far it would go. Not Maria, not the Hawthorns, not even Bryce. Only Amara sensed the path unfolding, because she had walked paths like this her entire life. The aircraft doors sealed, the cabin lights adjusted, the engines exhaled a low, rising rumble, and a story that had begun with a quiet assumption was about to rewrite itself. The engines of the Aurora LX900 continued their low, steady hum, warming like a giant creature stretching awake. Outside, the faint glow of morning had brightened into a pale gold wash across the horizon. Inside the cabin, however, the air felt still, suspended between quiet tension and unspoken truths. Captain Bryce Harrington stood inside the cockpit, one hand resting against the edge of the instrument panel. He stared at the illuminated displays, though his mind was far from screens and switches. His jaw worked silently, tightening and loosening as he replayed the confrontation with Amara Sterling again and again. A passenger refusing a seating request was not unheard of, but something about her calm defiance unsettled him. It felt like a refusal wrapped not in attitude but in certainty. And Bryce did not like certainty that did not originate from him. He straightened his collar, adjusting the fabric with short, impatient tugs. His co-pilot, a young man named Stevens, glanced over but said nothing. He knew better than to interrupt when the captain stood in that rigid posture, gripping silence like a weapon. Do we have clearance to taxi? Sir Stevens finally asked. Soon, Bryce muttered. He tapped a button with more force than necessary. His reflection in the darkened glass of the overhead panel stared back with a tight expression. Lines around his mouth seemed deeper this morning. He exhaled through his nose, A controlled breath meant to ground himself, though it did little. He prided himself on order, on hierarchy, on knowing exactly where everyone belonged. And in his world, clarity came easily. Wealth looked a certain way. Authority moved a certain way. Passengers like Victor and Elaine fit the picture perfectly. Passengers like Amara Sterling did not. She was calm, too calm, confident in a way that did not match her appearance. It confused him, and Bryce disliked confusion more than confrontation. Stevens adjusted a series of toggles and finally said, "We should notify ground control in the next few minutes." Bryce nodded without looking up. "I will handle it." Inside the cabin, Maria Evans double-checked the overhead compartments. Her movements were quieter than usual, almost hesitant. She sensed the growing friction inside the aircraft and carried the fear of what friction could become in an enclosed space. Her hands trembled slightly each time she reached for a latch. Amara watched her from her seat, noticing the way the young woman seemed to shrink into herself. She recognized that posture. She had worn it once, many years ago, before learning how to stand tall, even in rooms where people tried to make her small. As Maria passed, Amara spoke softly. "You are doing your job well." The words almost startled Maria. She blinked, momentarily taken aback. "Thank you, Ms. Sterling." She swallowed. "I just want this flight to go smoothly." "It will," Amara replied. Her voice held a quiet conviction, the kind that did not promise ease but offered steadiness. Maria held that reassurance like a lifeline as she continued preparing the cabin. Behind them, Elaine turned slightly, eyeing the interaction with suspicion. Her chin lifted. "I do not understand why she is being accommodated like this," she whispered to Victor. "It sets the wrong tone." Victor sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Elaine, please, let it rest. The flight will start soon." "I am just saying," she insisted, lowering her voice further, "that some people forget their place." Amara heard the words. She did not react. Years of absorbing such statements had taught her to let them pass through her like wind through tall grass. Bend, do not break. But inside her chest, something stirred. Not anger, something quieter. Deeper, a reminder of every door she had pushed open despite hands trying to close it. A reminder of every room where silence was expected of her and why she had chosen not to give it. Moments later, Bryce re-entered the cabin. He walked with a sense of finality, as if he had already decided the outcome. His boots sounded firm against the aisle flooring. When he reached Amara's row, he paused, his shoulders squared with authority he believed unquestionable. "Ms. Sterling," he said, his tone controlled yet threaded with impatience. "I spoke with ground personnel. They asked that I confirm all passengers are following seating regulations before we depart. It would be simpler for everyone if you agreed to move." Elaine's face brightened with satisfaction. Maria froze near the galley, her breath caught in her throat. Amara lifted her eyes slowly, meeting Bryce's stare with steady calm. "I have followed every instruction given to me, Captain." His jaw tightened. "Your refusal is causing operational delay." She studied him for a moment, noting the intensity behind his words, his need to win, his need to be right, his need to reassert the order she had disrupted simply by existing in a space he did not expect her to occupy. Then she said, "Captain, your issue is not my seat. It is your assumption about who should sit in it." The words were soft, but they struck like a chord vibrating through the cabin. Elaine's expression flickered. Victor looked up from his device. Even Maria's eyes widened slightly. Bryce's stance stiffened. "I do not appreciate accusations. Miss Sterling, then stop giving them reason to exist." Her reply was steady, unshaken. Silence fell again, thick enough that even the hum of the engines seemed muted. Bryce took one step closer, his voice lowering. "If you continue to obstruct, The cockpit door clicked open. Stephen stepped out, his gaze uncertain. Captain, ground control is requesting confirmation for taxi. They need approval. Bryce did not turn to him. His attention stayed locked on Amara, as though letting go of the confrontation would mean losing ground. He considered his by default. Stevens waited a beat, then spoke again. Sir, they are asking for you now. Bryce inhaled deeply, the kind of breath a man takes when confronted with something he cannot yet bend to his will. Finally, he gave a clipped nod. Secure the cabin, he said to Maria without looking at her. Maria nodded, though her voice trembled when she replied, Yes. Captain? Bryce walked back to the cockpit. The door closed. Elaine shifted in her seat with clear frustration. This is ridiculous, she said sharply, completely ridiculous. Victor leaned back, exhaling long and slow. Enough, Elaine. We will arrive. Let it be. But Elaine could not. Her pride had been pricked, and pride, once wounded, demanded attention. Maria hurried through the aisle, giving final checks. When she reached Amara's seat, she paused for a moment, recognizing the emotional storm swirling around them all. Thank you for staying calm, she whispered. Amara offered a gentle nod. Calm is sometimes the loudest answer. The engines deepened their vibration as the aircraft prepared to taxi. The cabin lights shifted subtly. Outside, the runway stretched long and open beneath the growing sunlight. Inside, however, nothing felt open. Things had been set in motion that none of them could stop. And though the flight was about to begin, the true journey had only just awakened. The aircraft began its slow movement away from the terminal, rolling with a smooth glide that sent a faint vibration through the floor. The cabin lights settled into a soft white glow, warm enough to ease the senses, but bright enough to reveal every anxious expression still lingering in the room. Amara Sterling kept her gaze steady through the small window beside her. Denver's runway stretched long and quiet beneath the morning light, the sky now shifting toward a pale blue scattered with thin clouds. Snow still clung to patches of grass along the taxiway, sparkling like grains of glass. It was peaceful in a way that felt almost deceptive, as if nature had no interest in the tension contained inside the sleek jet gliding across its surface. She had chosen seat 1C intentionally. The position gave her space to settle her thoughts, to breathe freely before another long day of meetings, decisions, and responsibilities. The seat had always been a place of preparation for her, a moment suspended between earth and air, between the weight of leadership and the quiet of solitude. Yet today, the air around her felt heavier, not unbearable, just filled with a familiar ache. Elaine Hawthorne shifted again, making her irritation known through small, restless movements. She crossed and uncrossed her legs, adjusted her coat collar, smoothed the fabric over her knees, and sighed in ways that carried meaning even without words. Victor leaned back, staring at his phone but no longer absorbed in it, as though sensing the morning had slipped out of his control. Maria Evans moved gently between seats, checking armrests, seatbelts, and compartments with care. Her fingers were steadier now, though a faint hesitation still lingered in each movement. She kept glancing toward Amara, and as if confirming that the woman who had remained composed through the storm was still anchored, still breathing calmly. Amara leaned back slightly, closing her eyes for a brief moment. The memory of her mother's voice rose quietly from the past, carried like a breath of warmth. You are made from strong hands, Amara, not to push others, but to hold firm when they try to move you. That memory steadied her. It always had. A soft chime sounded through the cabin. Captain Bryce Harrington's voice filled the space again, this time controlled, even free from the irritation that had sharpened his earlier tone. We are cleared for takeoff. Please remain seated with your belts secured. The announcement was formal, shaped by training and discipline, but beneath the surface, Amara could still sense the flicker of unresolved tension in his voice. Bryce was not a man who liked losing ground, and despite his rank, despite his stature, he had not been able to compel her to move. That truth simmered beneath his professionalism. The jet turned into position at the end of the runway. The engines deepened, humming with rising power. The cabin vibrated lightly as thrust increased, gathering momentum like a steady heartbeat preparing for a sprint. Maria braced herself near the bulkhead, hands placed carefully behind her. Elaine gripped her armrests. Victor's gaze lifted from his screen, acknowledging the shift from waiting to motion. Amara inhaled deeply as the engines roared. Takeoff had always been her favorite moment, the point where ground fell away, the point where heaviness loosened its hold, the point where she felt closest to the woman she had worked so hard to become. The jet surged forward, pressing each passenger gently into their seats. The runway blurred, the nose lifted, the cabin tilted upward, and the aircraft left the earth behind with a smooth, confident rise into open sky. For a moment, the world became quiet again. As the aircraft leveled and the engines settled into their steady cruising hum, Maria approached Amara's row with a gentle smile. "Is everything comfortable for you?" "Ms. Sterling." Amara gave a small nod. "Yes, thank you." Maria relaxed a little. She had feared an eruption, but none had come. She admired Amara's peaceful strength, though she could not yet explain why. Behind them, Elaine shook her head as she unbuckled her belt. "Honestly, Victor, I cannot believe how that was handled. There are procedures. There are expectations. I have flown this line for years. Not once have I seen such defiance." Victor lowered his voice, though not enough. "You saw how the captain reacted. He will sort it out." "It is not our fight." Elaine scoffed. "That woman behaves as if she belongs in that seat more than we do." Amara heard the words clearly, but she simply closed her eyes for a moment, letting them drift away like dust carried by wind. She had no desire to dignify them with response. When she opened her eyes, Maria was already a few rows back, assisting another passenger. Her shoulders visibly relaxed when she saw Amara remain unbothered. A soft voice traveled from the seat behind her. "I do not see what the issue is," Victor said, tapping his thumb against the side of his phone. "A seat is a seat. We will land in Seattle all the same." Elaine's reply came sharp. "That is not the point. The point is order matters, structure matters. People should know where they fit in it." Victor paused. Amara could almost sense his discomfort. Despite his flaws, something inside him resisted the bluntness of Elaine's worldview. But he said nothing else. Silence settled between them like a stone too heavy to lift. Amara turned her gaze back toward the window. The sky outside stretched endlessly, soft streaks of white drifting across shades of blue. From up here, borders seemed invisible. Divisions felt small. People's assumptions appeared as thin as threads. Yet those assumptions carried weight when they were wielded carelessly. The intercom chimed again. Bryce's voice entered the cabin. "We are now at cruising altitude. Cabin service will begin shortly." This time, tension seeped through even the formal cadence. He spoke like a man trying to hold on to control with the edges of his fingertips. Maria prepared the service card, her motions smooth but quiet. She approached Amara first. "Would you like water or something warm to drink?" "Water is fine," Amara replied softly. Maria's smile held a touch of gratitude. She served her, then moved to the hawthorns. Elaine accepted her drink without eye contact. Victor gave a polite nod, though he looked tired, as if the morning had drained more from him than he expected. Once Maria had stepped away, Amara placed her tumbler aside and allowed her body to settle deeper into the seat. The hum of the engines formed a steady rhythm, grounding her thoughts. She reflected on her past, on the rooms she once entered where people looked only at her skin, on the meetings where her ideas were dismissed until repeated by someone else, on the times colleagues asked her whose assistant she was, despite her name being printed on the door. Seat 1C was not simply a seat. It was a reminder of the climb, of the night spent working alone when others slept, of the belief that she deserved to occupy the spaces she earned. The morning's confrontation was not new. It was simply another chapter in a story she had known far too well. But this time, the setting was different. This time, the roles were reversed. This time, she was no longer the woman fighting for a place at someone else's table. She owned the table, and the plane, and the company flying it. Yet she felt no desire for revenge, only the desire for truth to reveal itself in its own time. A soft ping sounded from the cockpit, followed by muffled voices. Something about the tone made Maria turn slightly, concern flashing across her expression. Amara noticed. A shift was approaching. The air had changed again. Not dangerous, just inevitable. She placed her hands gently around her water cup and waited for whatever the sky would carry next. The soft clink of glass against metal echoed faintly as Maria arranged the empty cups on her service tray. The cabin had settled into a fragile calm, the kind that rested over people like thin frost waiting for the slightest warmth to break it. Sunlight filtered through the windows, spilling across the aisle in pale gold strips that moved with the aircraft's gentle sway. Amara Sterling sat quietly in seat 1C, her posture relaxed but attentive. She could feel the subtle hum beneath her, the steady heartbeat of the jet carrying them through the sky. She had always admired the way an aircraft moved, weightless yet grounded in absolute precision. The balance between power and grace reminded her of something her mother once said. Strength does not need to roar, it only needs to remain unshaken. The cabin, however, did not share that stillness. A few rows behind her, Elaine Hawthorne adjusted her coat again. Though the cabin temperature was perfectly comfortable, her movements were restless. A betraying frustration she could no longer mask. She watched the steady rise and fall of Amara's shoulders with a mixture of confusion and irritation, as if waiting for something to break in the woman who refused to bend. She leaned toward her husband, speaking in a whisper that carried far more weight than volume. "Victor, this is not how it should be." Victor rubbed his brow, exhaustion settling in the lines around his eyes. "I know, Elaine. But what else do you want done?" The captain already tried. "That is precisely the issue," she replied sharply. "He tried, but she did not yield. And now everyone is tiptoeing as if she were someone important." Victor's sigh was heavy. "Can we just let this flight continue? We have enough to prepare for today." Elaine pulled her coat tighter, as though wrapping herself in her own discontent. Her gaze returned to Amara, but the confusion in her eyes had deepened. It was not simply resentment now. It was something closer to disbelief, as if she could not imagine a world where someone like Amara simply stayed still. Maria approached Amara again, her steps soft, her posture careful. "Ms. Sterling, can I take this for you?" she asked, motioning to the water cup. "Yes, of course," Amara replied with a gentle smile. When Maria reached out, her fingers brushed the edge of the cup, and she hesitated for a moment. "I hope everything is all right," she whispered. Amara breathed in slowly. Her voice, when she answered, carried a warmth that seemed to steady the younger woman. "Everything is exactly where it needs to be." Maria nodded, though her eyes revealed a question she was afraid to ask. She took the cup and returned to the galley with a quiet determination to hold the morning together, thread by thread. Inside the cockpit, the mood was far different. Captain Bryce Harrington tightened his grip on the yoke, even though autopilot held the aircraft steady. The tension in his shoulders had not eased since takeoff. Stevens, seated beside him, adjusted the trim and glanced over cautiously. "Sir, we are on stable course. Weather is clear ahead." Bryce gave a curt nod. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon through the front windshield, but the quiet between them carried a weight that said the flight was anything but smooth for him. He replayed Amara's defiant stillness in his mind. The way she had looked at him, calm, certain, unmoved. He had encountered difficult passengers, entitled passengers, rude passengers, but this was different. She was none of those things. And somehow, that unsettled him even more. "You all right?" Captain Stevens asked carefully. Bryce exhaled sharply, though he tried to mask it as clearing his throat. Everything is under control, but even he could hear the strain in his voice. Back in the cabin, the tension that had thinned after takeoff now began to thicken again. It was subtlest, like the tightening of a thread. Maria noticed it first. She paused mid-step, sensing the shift in the air. She looked toward the cockpit door, then toward Amara, then toward Elaine, as though trying to understand where the unease originated. Elaine leaned closer to Victor, lowering her voice even further. "You saw how he looked at her," she whispered. "The captain has dealt with passengers like that before. He will find a way." Victor closed his eyes briefly, as if wishing the conversation would end. "Elaine, please," but she continued. "A seat like that is not meant for—" She hesitated, searching for a word that would not sound as sharp as the one she wanted to use. "For people who do not understand protocol?" Maria flinched slightly at the comment, though she tried to hide it. Amara remained still. The words washed over her like familiar rain. She did not need to challenge them. Her existence in that seat was challenge enough. She took a slow breath and let her thoughts drift. She remembered her first business flight, years ago. The stairs, the pauses, the puzzled looks when she sat in first class wearing a worn blazer she had thrifted from a small shop in Atlanta. She remembered the man who asked her twice if she was lost. The woman who assumed she was a student, not an executive. Seats had always held meaning she never asked for. And now she sat in a seat she had chosen. A seat she had earned. A seat that was hers simply because she decided it would be. Yet people still tried to move her from it. The cabin lights shifted slightly as the aircraft passed through a thin veil of cloud. The brightness softened, wrapping the room in a quiet glow that made everything feel closer. Maria approached Amara again, gently. "We will be serving breakfast shortly," she said. "Would you prefer something light or warm?" "Light is fine," Amara replied. Maria nodded and hesitated, as though wanting to say more. "You have handled everything with such grace. Ms. Sterling." Amara held her gaze for a soft moment. Grace is easier when you stop asking permission to exist. Maria's breath caught. She held that sentence in her palms like something fragile and precious. Then she returned to the galley, renewed by a strength she had not known she needed. Behind them. Elaine shook her head again, muttering under her breath. "I cannot imagine sitting there without shame." That was when Amara finally turned her head. Just slightly. Her voice quiet enough to avoid confrontation, but strong enough to reach Elaine's ears. "Shame comes from doing harm, not from holding your place." Elaine stiffened. She had not expected a response. Certainly not one so calm. She looked at Amara with a mixture of surprise and something else she could not yet name. Victor gave his wife a warning look. "Enough." Elaine did not reply. For the first time since boarding, the woman who always filled silence with judgment had nothing to say. Maria glanced back, catching the moment. Relief softened her shoulders. Amara returned her gaze to the window. The sky stretched endless in every direction, as if reminding her that elevation was not always measured in altitude, but in endurance. The aircraft continued its steady path. Breakfast trays would soon be served. The morning would move forward. But beneath the quiet routine, something deeper had shifted. The seat Amara occupied had become more than a seat. It had become a fault line. A quiet one, but powerful enough to unsettle those who built their worldview on assumptions. And though the flight continued without turbulence, everyone aboard could feel the air thickening in anticipation. Because the storm had not passed. It had only paused, waiting. The soft aroma of brewed coffee drifted through the cabin as Maria prepared the breakfast service. She moved quietly, her motions deliberate, as though afraid to disturb a fragile thread running through the air. The morning light had shifted again, sliding across the aisle in long, pale strokes that made everything look suspended, like a moment waiting to decide what it wanted to become. Amara sat with her hands resting gently on her lap, her gaze drifting across the patterned shadows on the carpet. She carried a stillness that felt earned, not performed, and it wrapped around her like a silent shield. For years she had learned to let silence speak on her behalf, because there were places where words were often twisted before they left her lips. Yet even her calm presence could not hide the rising pressure inside the cabin. Elaine Hawthorne cleared her throat for what felt like the third time in 5 minutes. It was not a real need, just a habit formed when impatience clawed beneath her composure. She looked around as though expecting someone to intervene, someone to restore the world to the version she preferred. Her voice broke the quiet. "Victor, this can't continue. The captain should have come out by now. He needs to resolve this before the next phase of the flight begins." Victor pinched the bridge of his nose, leaning his head back wearily. "Elaine, please, not now." But she pressed on. "This is a premium charter. The seating protocol should be clear. I do not understand why we are the only ones who seem to care." Maria stiffened slightly from the galley, but she continued preparing the trays, careful not to draw attention. Victor replied under his breath, "Because no one else sees the problem you do." Elaine's eyes narrowed. Or perhaps everyone is waiting for someone to say the truth out loud. Her gaze drifted forward, landing on the back of Amara's seat with an intensity sharp enough to pierce fabric. Yet Amara did not turn. She breathed in slowly, letting the tension wash past her without absorbing it. Maria approached Amara again, placing a neatly arranged tray on the side table. "Here's your breakfast, Miss Sterling. Fresh fruit and oatmeal as you requested." "Thank you, Maria." Maria hesitated before stepping away. She lowered her voice. "If you need anything at all, anything, please let me know." Amara gave a calm nod. The warmth in her eyes was soft but steady, the kind that made people rethink the way they treated the world. As Maria moved back to the galley, she caught Victor watching Amara quietly. He looked away quickly, but not before something flickered across his face. It wasn't resentment. It wasn't discomfort. It was recognition. He had seen dignity before, and he knew the weight of it, inside the cockpit. Captain Bryce Harrington adjusted a few settings, though none of them truly required adjustment. Stevens watched him carefully. "Sir, we're on standard route. No weather interference. Everything looks good." Bryce gave a faint grunt in response, but good was not how he felt. The silence in the cabin had followed him into the cockpit, thickening behind his ribs. His jaw tightened as he replayed that moment again and again. The calm way she looked at him. He looked down at his own hands, gripping the controls. They were steady, but something coiled uncomfortably beneath the surface. He was a man used to authority resting on his shoulders like a mantle. This morning, the mantle felt misaligned. "Do you think we should check on the cabin?" Stevens asked gently. Bryce turned sharply. "No. My place is here until necessary." Stevens nodded and did not speak again. Back in the cabin, the breakfast service began with quiet efficiency. Maria moved down the aisle, her steps light, her voice gentle. But she felt Elaine's eyes lingering on her like unwelcome heat. Elaine spoke again, this time louder. Excuse me." Maria paused. "Yes, Mrs. Hawthorne. I find it unusual that the captain hasn't checked on us yet. I would like you to inform him that we expect an update, preferably soon." Maria steadied her voice. "Mrs. Hawthorne, the captain will address the cabin if needed." At the moment, Elaine cut her off. "At the moment, I am making a request." Before Maria could reply, Victor intervened, his tone weary. "Elaine, let the crew work." She looked at him with disbelief. "Are you truly fine with how this is unfolding?" Victor exhaled. I am trying to be. Elaine's voice sharpened. This flight is not functioning the way it should. I know what premium service looks like. We represent a certain standard. Victor. But the way she said standard seemed less about service and more about who she believed deserved what. Amara lifted her spoon, though she hadn't yet taken a bite. She looked straight ahead, her expression thoughtful. She could feel the emotional temperature rising behind her, a subtle wave building in strength. Maria returned to the galley with the empty tray from another row and set it down. Her hands trembled slightly. She closed her eyes, centering herself. When she turned around, she saw something that startled her. Amara had risen from her seat. She moved slowly down the aisle, smooth and unhurried, as if she were navigating through a fragile landscape. When she reached the rear of the cabin, she paused by the window, resting her hand lightly on the seat back. Maria stepped forward instinctively. Miss Sterling, is everything all right? Amara nodded gently. I just needed a moment. Her voice carried a quiet weight, enough for Victor to look back again. Elaine watched her closely, suspicion tightening her features. Amara continued speaking, though her tone remained soft. Sometimes silence can feel heavier than noise. Maria swallowed hard. I understand. Elaine's eyebrows lifted. Do you... Amara turned slightly. Not confrontational. Simply present. Yes, I believe she does. Elaine straightened, a spark of indignation flaring. And what exactly is that supposed to mean? Amara met her gaze with calm steadiness. It means that sometimes people carry more than what's visible. And sometimes the way we treat others reveals what we carry ourselves. Elaine opened her mouth to respond, but the words didn't come as quickly as before. Something in Amara's tone unsettled her. Not because it was harsh, but because it was true. Maria felt the air shift, just slightly. A string pulled taut had loosened. Amara returned to her seat, her movements unhurried, as if reclaiming her space without asking permission. The morning light caught her profile, illuminating the quiet strength in her expression. Victor leaned toward his wife and whispered, almost too quietly to hear, maybe we should just let this be. Elaine didn't answer. In the cockpit, Bryce looked up abruptly, sensing the subtle change in cabin activity through the shift of weight on the aircraft's floor. Even without seeing it, he felt control slipping, not mechanically, but in the narrative unfolding behind him. His pulse tapped faster. He reached for the intercom button, then hesitated. His finger hovered there, caught between compulsion and uncertainty. He lowered his hand slowly. He needed time, but time was the one thing a flight couldn't stretch. Back in the cabin, breakfast trays were being collected, and the hum of the engines filled the quiet again. A gentler calm settled, not because the conflict was gone, but because something deeper had begun to surface. People were reconsidering, reevaluating, rethinking, especially the woman who had been the most certain of all. Elaine looked out the window, her reflection faint in the glass. It took her a while before she whispered something that no one else heard. Why do I feel as if I've misunderstood something important? The question lingered in the air like a soft echo. Outside, clouds rolled by in slow, drifting shapes. Inside the cabin, the storm had not ended, but a new layer had formed beneath it. Something quieter, something more human, something beginning to crack open. The aircraft glided smoothly across the upper atmosphere, its engines humming in a rhythm that felt almost meditative. Sunlight gathered at the windows, forming soft halos that drifted over the leather seats and brushed across the aisle in patches of gold. The morning had matured into something quieter but heavier, as though the flight itself sensed that clarity was beginning to seep into places where assumptions had long taken root. Amara Sterling remained seated, her hands folded loosely, her gaze calm but contemplative. Moments earlier, she had stood at the back of the cabin, and the movement had unsettled more than just the quiet. It had shifted something deeper, something that made people sit a little straighter, Breathe a little slower. Think a little longer. Her stillness now felt different, more grounded, more defined, as if the sky around them held its breath, waiting for what her presence might reveal next. Maria Evans checked the galley once more before stepping into the aisle. The breakfast service was nearly complete, and she forced her hands to stay steady as she carried the last tray back to the front. Her eyes drifted toward Amara again, drawn by a mixture of admiration and concern. When she reached seat 1C, she leaned in slightly. Ms. Sterling, would you like tea as well? Amara lifted her gaze, warm and steady. Yes, if it's not too much trouble. Maria smiled softly. Never. She turned back toward the galley, comforted by the simplicity of the exchange. But as she passed row 3, Elaine Hawthorne's voice tightened the air again. Excuse me, Miss... She called out. Maria paused. Yes, Mrs. Hawthorne? Elaine folded her hands over her lap, her shoulders stiff. I saw Ms. Sterling walking around earlier. I believe the captain should be made aware. For safety reasons? Maria's heart clenched. She kept her expression neutral. Mrs. Hawthorne, passengers are permitted to stand briefly as long as conditions are stable. Elaine shook her head. That may be the rule, but I hardly think wandering the cabin during unresolved tensions is wise. Victor looked away, but his quiet sigh was enough to show he shared neither her concern nor her perspective. Maria steadied herself. Mrs. Hawthorne, the situation is under control. If the captain needs to be informed, I promise you he will be... Elaine's voice sharpened. I would prefer he hears it from you. Maria paused in silence before answering. I will make sure the cabin remains safe. Thank you for your concern. She walked back toward the galley, and for a brief moment, she felt the weight of so many mornings like this. The weight of having to hold the peace in rooms where peace was not evenly valued. When she reached the front, she took a slow breath, then began preparing the tea for Amara. Her movements became steady again, returned to the rhythm of someone who found strength in serving well, even when the world around her felt unfair. Inside the cockpit, Captain Bryce Harrington leaned back in his seat, staring at the navigation display as though it held answers he could not articulate. He had flown through storms, evacuated passengers in emergencies, and handled more mechanical failures than most pilots his age. Yet nothing had unsettled him like the quiet defiance of Seat 1C. He glanced at Stevens. Anything from the cabin? Stevens shook his head. All quiet for now, sir. Maria is doing well holding things together. Bryce scrubbed a hand over his jaw. Good. Keep monitoring cabin pressure and turbulence reports. If anything shifts, I want to know immediately. Stevens hesitated. Captain, are you expecting trouble? Bryce didn't answer at first. He looked out the windshield at the horizon, a vast stretch of blue that made everything inside the aircraft suddenly feel small. I'm expecting clarity, he said finally. One way or another. Back in the cabin. Maria returned with the warm tea. She placed the cup gently on the table beside Amara. Here you go, Ms. Sterling. Thank you, Maria. Amara replied softly. Maria lingered for a moment. You carry yourself with such strength, she whispered. I wanted to say that. Amara took a slow breath. Sometimes strength is simply choosing not to move when you know the ground belongs to you. Maria's throat tightened. She nodded and stepped away before emotion revealed itself more clearly. A few rows back, Victor watched the exchange quietly. His expression carried an emotion he had not shown earlier in the flight. Something like reflection. Something like a slowly dawning understanding. Elaine noticed and frowned. What is it? Victor hesitated. Nothing. Elaine leaned closer, lowering her voice. Don't tell me you are being swayed by her performance. Victor turned toward the window, the sky reflecting softly in his eyes. I just think maybe we misunderstood her. Elaine blinked, startled. Misunderstood what? She refused the captain's instruction, and she made things uncomfortable for everyone. How could we possibly misunderstand someone like that? Victor replied quietly, almost to himself. Maybe that's exactly the question. Elaine stiffened, an unfamiliar uncertainty forming in her expression. She did not argue further. She simply stared at her hands, as though suddenly unsure what they should do. The cabin lights shifted again as the aircraft entered a stretch of thin cloud. A soft dimness filled the room, making the mood feel more introspective. The world outside blurred slightly, creating a sense of distance that made the cabin seem even more intimate. Amara slowly lifted her cup, savoring the first warm sip of tea. The steam rose gently, carrying a scent that reminded her of quiet mornings spent reading at her mother's kitchen table. Those mornings had shaped her, built her, taught her the kind of calm that lasted longer than anger ever could. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the memory wash over her. When she opened them, she noticed Victor watching her, not with hostility, not with judgment, but with something closer to realization. He looked away quickly when their eyes met, clearing his throat as if caught in a moment he hadn't meant to have. Elaine noticed again. Victor, what is happening with you today? He didn't answer, and that unsettled her more than anything else had. Maria stepped forward once more, this time addressing both Hawthorns with practiced composure. Would either of you like anything else before we begin preparing for descent later? Victor shook his head politely. No, thank you, Maria. Elaine hesitated, then finally shook her head too. Her expression had softened in small, almost invisible ways. As Maria walked back toward the galley, she noticed Amara glance in her direction with a soft nod. Maria returned it, feeling a renewed determination rise within her. Something was shifting. Something deep. Something that would not return to where it had been before this flight. Inside the cockpit, Bryce adjusted the throttle slightly and exhaled. He couldn't shake the unsettled feeling tugging at his mind. Something about the cabin felt different. Stevens glanced at him. Captain, you look like you're waiting on something. Bryce kept his gaze ahead. Maybe I am. The engines hummed steadily. The clouds parted. The light grew brighter again, filling the cabin with a soft, rising glow. In that glow, every passenger sat quietly, but not passively. Everyone was thinking. Everyone was wondering. Everyone was beginning to sense that the story unfolding at 35,000 feet had much more beneath its surface, especially the woman in seat 1C, who held her cup of tea as though holding something far more important. Her place, her truth, her right to exist exactly where she chose to be. It was not the moment of revelation yet, but it was the moment before it. The moment when the air thickened, the silence deepened, and the truth began to hover at the edge of the room, waiting to step forward. The light in the cabin had softened into a muted glow, the kind of brightness that eased itself gently across the skin. The aircraft held a steady altitude, gliding through strands of thin cloud that drifted past the windows like slow-moving breath. There was a quiet calm inside, but not an empty one. It felt filled with thoughts unsaid, questions unasked, and realizations beginning to form like shapes in fog. Amara Sterling sat with her tea still warm beside her, her gaze focused on the horizon beyond the window. She had not spoken since returning to her seat. She didn't need to. Her presence alone, calm and unwavering, cast a kind of reflection across the cabin, forcing everyone to see themselves more clearly than they intended. Victor Hawthorne shifted slightly in his seat. His hands were clasped together, thumbs brushing back and forth in a slow rhythm. Several times he opened his mouth as if to say something to his wife, but the words never came. Elaine, noticing his unusual quietness, finally sighed, "You're unsettled today." "I can tell." Victor didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the clouds drifting past the window. "I'm thinking," he said simply. Elaine frowned. "About what?" Victor hesitated, then answered in a low voice. "About what it means to be wrong." "Elaine." The words landed between them like a stone gently placed instead of thrown. Elaine leaned back slightly, almost recoiling from the weight of it. "Wrong. Truly." Victor nodded once. Elaine crossed her arms, but the movement lacked its usual sharpness. She stared at her lap, her expression taut with something she rarely allowed to surface. Uncertainty. Maria Evans emerged from the galley again, her posture a little straighter than before. There was purpose in her steps now, a kind of inner strength that had grown quietly throughout the morning. She approached each row, checking on passengers with a calm she had earned the hard way. When she reached Amara's row, she stopped gently. "Ms. Sterling, is everything still comfortable for you?" Amara turned to her with warm openness. "Yes, Maria, it's... Thank you for checking. You're doing your job well." Maria's chest lifted, as if that single sentence had strengthened something fragile inside her. "Thank you," she whispered. She walked toward the hawthorns next. The shift in the air around them was subtle but clear. Victor's shoulders had softened. Elaine, however, seemed to sit with a rigid discomfort, as though unsure where to place her thoughts. "Would you like anything else, Mr. Hawthorne?" "No, thank you, Maria," Victor replied gently. "And you, Mrs. Hawthorne?" Elaine hesitated. She parted her lips, then closed them. Finally, she shook her head without meeting Maria's eyes. Maria nodded and placed another folded napkin on their table before returning to the front. Inside the cockpit, Captain Bryce Harrington stared at the control panel with an expression that looked more like someone wrestling with himself than monitoring the aircraft. Stevens glanced at him discreetly before adjusting a few switches. "Sir, everything in the cabin appears stable. Maria hasn't signaled any issues." Bryce exhaled slowly. "But something is shifting. I can feel it." Stevens sat back. "With respect, sir, maybe that's a good thing." Bryce turned to him, surprise flickering across his eyes. "How so?" Stevens shrugged lightly. "People get uncomfortable right before they understand something important." Bryce didn't answer. He stared at the horizon again. But this time his expression carried a hint of thoughtfulness beneath the tension. Back in the cabin, Amara gently rested her hands on the fold-down table. Her fingertips brushed across the thin line of condensation on the outside of her cup. She watched how it shimmered briefly in the faint sunlight, reflecting tiny fragments of the world around her. It reminded her of childhood mornings sitting on the porch with her mother in rural Georgia. How her mother would place a warm mug of tea in her small hands and say softly, "Baby, the world won't always make room for you, so you will have to learn how to make your own space without losing your peace." Those words weren't lessons. They were anchors. They had followed her into boardrooms, negotiations, and long nights studying financial reports until her vision blurred. And now they followed her here, to a seat she earned, a seat someone else believed she should not have. Elaine shifted again. Then she leaned forward slightly, looking toward Amara from her row. Her voice, still tight but less sharp, reached Victor. "I don't understand her confidence. She sits there as if she knows something the rest of us don't." Victor looked at his wife with an expression softer than earlier. "Maybe she does." Elaine blinked, taken aback. "How could you possibly say that? We don't even know who she is." Victor took a slow breath. "And maybe that's the point. We don't know her, but we assumed we did." Elaine opened her mouth to reply, but the words faltered. Her gaze shifted toward the aisle where Amara sat, poised and calm in a way that felt both familiar and unfamiliar. Elaine studied her, not with hostility now, but with a quiet confusion she couldn't fully shake off. Maria returned to the front, retrieving a stack of service items. She reorganized them carefully, each movement precise and meaningful. She felt the gradual shift happening around her. For the first time since boarding, she sensed the possibility of understanding taking root where judgment once stood. She approached Amara again, not because procedure required it, but because something in her heart urged her to. Ms. Sterling, would you like more tea? Amara smiled gently. Not right now. Thank you. Maria. Maria bowed her head slightly before stepping away. As she did, she caught Victor watching Amara with a deepening sense of contemplation. Elaine lowered her voice again. I can't explain it, Victor, but something feels different. About her. About all of this. Victor nodded slowly. I know. Elaine stared at him. You do? Victor took a quiet breath. I think she carries something we've never had to carry. And because of that, she sees things differently. Elaine frowned in thought. For the first time that morning, her expression softened into something almost fragile. In the cockpit, Bryce leaned toward the cabin camera display, watching Maria move through the aisle. He noticed the calm around Amara's seat, the stillness that contrasted sharply with the tension earlier. He couldn't decipher what had changed, but he knew something had. He rubbed his jaw and murmured to himself, This flight has a mind of its own today. Stevens chuckled softly. Or maybe it's the people on it. The captain didn't respond, but he didn't dismiss the idea either. As the aircraft glided forward, the light outside shifted again. Shadows softened. The world took on a warm glow. In that glow, every passenger looked a little different than they had at takeoff. Victor appeared more thoughtful. Elaine looked uncertain but quieter. Maria carried renewed steadiness. Bryce wrestled with reflection he hadn't expected. And Amara sat like a woman who knew the ground would tilt before others even felt it. The engines hummed steadily, a low resonance that carried them through the sky. But beneath that sound, something else began to pulse. Recognition. Reconsideration. The first tremor of truth that had waited patiently all morning. And though no one said it aloud, the atmosphere held a quiet certainty. Whatever came next would change more than just the tone of the flight. It would change how they saw one another. It would change how they understood themselves. It would open the door for something that had been long overdue. The sky outside remained calm, but inside, something deeper had started to unfold, a shift not in altitude, but in awareness. The aircraft drifted through the upper atmosphere with the gentle steadiness of a breath held too long. Soft sunlight reached through the windows, stretching across the cabin in muted ribbons that swayed with the aircraft's subtle motion. Yet despite the brightness, a weight had settled inside the room. It wasn't loud. It didn't demand attention. It simply sat there, patient and undeniable. Maria Evans finished securing the last of the breakfast trays. Her steps were lighter than earlier, steadier, but her eyes still carried a shadow of worry. Something was different in the cabin now. Something she couldn't name yet, but felt deeply. Amara Sterling had not moved from her seat. The warm tea she had finished sat on the tray table, the faint scent lingering in the air. She kept her gaze on the horizon, calm but alert, as though listening to something beneath the usual hum of engines. She didn't look tense. She didn't look troubled. She simply looked present, and that alone seemed to shift the atmosphere around her. Elaine Hawthorne sat with her back straight but her confidence less certain. Her fingers tapped lightly on her armrest, a small habit that showed up only when doubt crept toward her. She kept glancing toward Amara, but each time her eyes lingered too long, she looked away, as if caught doing something she didn't want to admit. Beside her, Victor leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. His quietness had become a presence of its own, not withdrawn but reflective, as though the sky outside was giving him room to reconsider everything he thought he understood. Inside the cockpit, Captain Bryce Harrington shifted in his seat for what felt like the 100th time. He glanced at Stevens, then at the navigation screen, then at the cabin camera. Nothing was wrong, no turbulence, no mechanical issues, but his mind wouldn't settle. Stevens noticed. "You're uneasy, sir." Bryce pressed his lips together before answering. "Something in that cabin isn't sitting right. I can't explain it." Stevens tilted his head. "Maybe it's not something technical?" Bryce gave him a sharp look. "Then what is it?" Stevens hesitated, choosing his words with care. Sometimes the problem isn't the aircraft, and sometimes it's the assumptions we boarded with. The captain's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in discomfort. Stevens returned his attention to the gauges, leaving Bryce alone with a truth he didn't want to touch yet. Back in the cabin, Maria walked toward the front to check the storage compartment. As she passed row 3, Elaine spoke again, her voice lower this time, but without its earlier bite. "Excuse me, Maria." Maria paused, turning with a polite expression. "Yes, Mrs. Hawthorne." Elaine swallowed, choosing each word carefully. "When you get a moment, could you tell the captain I'd appreciate an update on our arrival schedule?" Maria blinked, surprised by the shift in tone. She nodded gently. "Of course, I'll let him know as soon as I finish here." Elaine nodded and looked down at her hands again. Her voice had lost its edge. Her frustration had softened into something else, something she wasn't ready to name. Victor watched her with quiet concern, the first crack in his wife's confidence making him rethink the morning even more. Maria continued toward the front. She passed Amara's seat and paused for a moment, drawn in by the calmness radiating from her. "Ms. Sterling, is everything truly all right?" Amara lifted her gaze. "Yes, Maria. Everything is unfolding the way it needs to." Maria felt something warm rise in her chest, something like reassurance but deeper. She bowed her head slightly before continuing to the cockpit. When she knocked and opened the door, Bryce turned his head quickly. "Everything all right out there?" Maria took a small breath. "Captain." Mrs. Hawthorne asked for an update on our arrival time. She said she'd appreciate it directly from you. Bryce frowned. "Did something happen?" Maria shook her head. "Nothing urgent, just tension that hasn't faded yet." Stevens leaned over slightly. "The Hawthorns are unsettled." "Understandable." Bryce exhaled sharply, not out of frustration toward Maria, but toward the pressure gathering in his own chest. "Tell her I'll make an announcement shortly. For now, return to the cabin. Keep things calm." Maria nodded. "Yes, Captain." When she closed the cockpit door, Bryce leaned back again, staring at the ceiling for a moment. He was a man who liked control, but control felt slippery today, like something he couldn't quite get a grip on. Back in the cabin, Maria resumed tidying, though her gaze kept drifting towards seat 1C. Something about Amara made her feel steadier, as if the quiet strength from that row rippled outward. Elaine suddenly spoke again, softer this time. "Maria." Maria turned. "I apologize if I was short with you earlier." Maria blinked once. The apology was unexpected, almost startling. "Thank you, Mrs. Hawthorne." Elaine nodded, then folded her hands again, as though unsure what to do with herself now that she had taken that step. Victor looked at her with a surprised but gentle softness. "You're trying," he whispered. Elaine didn't respond, but her eyes glistened with something unspoken. Maria walked toward the back of the cabin to collect a few additional service items. On her way, she glanced at Amara again, and once more. Her shoulders relaxed. Amara took a slow breath, her exhale steady, her posture unwavering. She could sense the shift happening around her, small but real. These were not the loud changes of confrontation. They were the quiet openings that came before understanding. Her mother used to say, "Sometimes the deepest change begins with the smallest crack in someone's certainty." Amara felt that crack forming, not as triumph, not as victory, but as a gentle space for truth to breathe. The engines hummed steadily. The air felt warmer. The captain's voice soon filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Harrington. We're making an excellent time and expect favorable winds ahead. I'll provide an update as we begin an initial descent." His tone was professional, but something in it trembled faintly, as if the confidence he was projecting did not fully match the tension inside him. Amara closed her eyes for a moment, sensing it. Elaine listened closely, her brow furrowing. Victor leaned back in his seat, processing each word. Maria watched the passengers carefully, making sure everyone remained calm. But calm was not the whole story. Something deeper was rising. Not chaos, not fear. Something like truth gathering itself, preparing to come forward. Amara opened her eyes and looked out the window again. The world below was distant, soft, and peaceful. But inside the cabin, the emotional air thickened, not with hostility, but with anticipation, a knowing, a prelude to revelation. And though no one else realized it yet, the moment they had all been moving toward since boarding was beginning to approach, quietly, inevitably, like a shift in wind long before a storm reveals itself. The air inside the cabin seemed to thicken in a way that could not be explained by pressure or altitude. It was subtle at first, like the gentle tightening of a string stretched just a little further than before. The brightness of the sky outside softened through a thin veil of cloud, bathing the seats in a muted glow that rendered every detail more intimate, more exposed. Amara Sterling sat quietly with her hands resting loosely on her lap. Her presence carried an unspoken gravity, though she herself did not appear to be trying to command anything. She simply existed with a stillness that invited reflection. Her eyes drifted from the window to the aisle and back again, not searching, not waiting, simply witnessing the unfolding of the morning with the quiet patience of someone who had long known how to read human storms before they arrived. Maria Evans approached her row once again. Though she tried to hide how her steps had slowed, she carried no tray this time. She simply wanted to check on Amara, drawn by a growing instinct she couldn't quite explain. When she reached seat 1C, she paused softly. "Ms. Sterling, may I bring you anything else? Water? Tea? Something warm?" Amara looked up with gentle warmth in her expression. "I'm all right, Maria, but thank you for asking." Maria nodded, reassured yet still feeling that strange pull in the air. She stepped back, folding her hands in front of her for a brief moment before returning to the galley. A few rows back, Elaine Hawthorne sat unnervingly quiet. Her posture was upright, almost rigid, but her eyes held something new. It wasn't irritation now, it wasn't indignation. It was something more vulnerable, something she had spent years refusing to acknowledge. Uncertainty. Victor watched her carefully. "Are you all right, Elaine?" Elaine didn't respond immediately. Her gaze flickered toward the front of the cabin where Amara sat. "Victor," she said softly, "something feels strange. I don't know how to explain it." Victor exhaled, leaning closer. "The only strange thing is that we're finally seeing what we didn't see before." Elaine blinked, startled by the gentleness of his voice. "What do you mean?" Victor hesitated, then answered really quietly. "Her... us. This whole morning, I think we've been assuming things we never questioned." Elaine's lips parted slightly in response. She looked away, the weight of his words settling heavily across her shoulders. Inside the cockpit, Captain Bryce Harrington tightened his hands on the control yoke, even though the aircraft was still in autopilot. His shoulders were tense, his breathing shallow, his mind restless in ways he wasn't used to. Stevens glanced at him, reading the troubled expression with careful eyes. "Captain, we're cruising smoothly. There's no turbulence ahead. Everything is stable. Bryce didn't relax. Something doesn't feel right. Stevens raised an eyebrow. With the aircraft or with the cabin? Bryce didn't answer at first. His gaze drifted toward the cabin camera feed. The image flickered slightly as it displayed the aisle, the quiet rows, the passengers sitting still. Finally, he spoke, his voice lower than usual. With me? Stevens nodded slowly, as though he had expected the admission. Sometimes clarity comes right before turbulence. Sir? Bryce gave him a sharp look. Are you speaking literally or metaphorically? Stevens cracked the faintest smile. Whichever helps. Bryce inhaled deeply and looked back at the horizon, the stretch of sky still bright and calm. But inside him, a storm had begun to stir. Back in the cabin, Maria stepped out of the galley with a small towel in her hands. She had planned to tidy the service counter, but something caught her attention. She stopped mid-step and looked toward the Hawthorne's row. Elaine was staring ahead, her face softened by an expression Maria had never seen from her before. It wasn't anger, it wasn't superiority, it was confusion, and something like quiet sorrow behind it. Maria hesitated, then approached. Mrs. Hawthorne, is there anything I can bring you? Elaine didn't look up at first. Her voice, when it came, was soft enough to surprise herself. No, thank you. Maria. Maria blinked. The lack of sharpness in the reply startled her. She glanced at Victor, who gave her a tired but reassuring nod. She stepped back slowly and returned to her tasks, a strange tension stirring in her chest. Amara looked toward the aisle in time to see the exchange. She didn't smile, but something thoughtful flickered across her eyes. She understood that the body sometimes softened before the mind did. She understood that clarity often came in quiet waves before revealing itself out loud. And she understood that people changed not in grand moments, but in small ones where silence became heavier than excuses. The engines hummed with their usual steady rhythm, providing a sense of continuity that the passengers desperately needed. Outside, the world stretched like a sea of blue and white, calm and endless. Inside, the cabin breathed in a slow, collective rhythm. And then something shifted. It was subtle, barely noticeable. A faint tremor beneath the floor. Amara felt it first, not through fear, but through instinct. She lifted her head slightly, listening. The hum of the engines had changed by only a fraction, just enough for someone attuned to movement to sense. Maria felt it next. She froze halfway through folding a napkin, her breath catching for just a second. She looked toward the ceiling lights, then toward the cockpit door. Elaine straightened, gripping the armrests. What was that? Victor looked up as well. It's probably nothing, but his voice wasn't fully confident. Inside the cockpit, Bryce's eyes snapped to the instrument panel. Stevens. Did you feel that? Yes, sir. Slight pressure shift, but no warning indicators yet. Bryce leaned forward, scanning the gauges. The readings were normal. The aircraft was stable, and yet something inside him tightened. Stevens checked the airspeed and altimeter. Everything looks fine. Could be just a pocket of softer air. Bryce nodded, but the tension in his jaw didn't ease. Back in the cabin, Maria stepped carefully toward the front, her voice aimed at Amara even though she kept it soft enough to avoid alarming others. Ms. Sterling. Did you sense I did? Amara answered gently. Maria swallowed, reassured but also unnerved. Elaine looked between them, alarm flickering in her eyes. Maria, what's happening? Victor placed a calming hand on her arm. Let's wait for the captain to speak. Elaine's voice trembled slightly. I don't like waiting. Maria stepped closer to them, her composure steady even as her pulse quickened. Everything is under control. The captain will update us if needed. Elaine nodded slowly, her breathing uneven but quieting. She looked toward Amara again, this time not with hostility, but with a strange, reluctant trust. Amara offered a small, grounding nod in return. The tremor did not repeat, but the atmosphere had changed. Inside the cockpit, Bryce inspected every gauge again. No abnormalities, no warnings, no turbulence ahead. Everything was technically sound, but something in his chest refused to settle. Stevens spoke quietly. "Do you want to inform the cabin, sir?" Bryce hesitated for a long moment. "Not yet. Let's monitor it for another minute." Stevens nodded. The captain leaned back, exhaling slowly. It wasn't fear he felt. It wasn't panic. It was something far more uncomfortable in his intuition. A sense that the air itself was waiting, as though the morning had been building towards something unseen. And for the first time that day, Bryce Harrington allowed himself to wonder if the tension in the cabin had nothing to do with protocol and everything to do with truth. Back in the cabin, the silence had deepened, but it wasn't empty. It was full, unsettling, expectant. Amara breathed in, her gaze steady. Whatever was coming next, she could feel it drawing closer, and the sky around them, still bright and calm, held its breath in quiet anticipation. The quiet inside the cabin held for a long stretch of minutes, so long that even the ever-present hum of the engines seemed to retreat to the background. It was the kind of silence that made people notice the sound of their own breathing. Soft, careful, almost hesitant. Amara Sterling remained seated. Though her posture had shifted subtly, her back was straighter now, her shoulders a little more attentive, her gaze drifting across the rows with the steady patience of someone who understood that tension often came not from noise, but from the weight of unspoken things pressing inward. Elaine Hawthorne clasped her hands tightly in her lap. The tremor from moments earlier had unsettled her deeply, though not in the dramatic way she once might have shown. No contorted expression, no raised voice, just a tightening around the eyes, a stiffness in her breath. Victor watched her from the seat beside her, leaning in just enough to be present without crowding her. His voice stayed low. "You're all right." That's all it was. Elaine exhaled shakily. "Victor, I've flown all my life. I've never reacted like this." "Because today isn't about turbulence," he answered quietly. "Not in the air, anyway." Elaine frowned at him, but her expression softened as her eyes moved toward the front of the cabin again. Settling briefly on Amara, something in her gaze lingered there, something she didn't fully understand yet. In the galley, Maria Evans had her palms pressed against the counter, grounding herself. She breathed once, slow, then again. When she stepped out into the aisle, her composure returned, but her eyes carried a new seriousness. She moved with intentional grace, checking each row without giving away her own unease. When she reached Amara's seat, she paused. "Ms. Sterling, everything still feels the same to you?" Amara looked up, her voice steady. "It feels like something is shifting, but nothing dangerous. Maria, just rising." Maria nodded, even if the words didn't fully soothe her. She stepped back to the galley but kept her eyes trained on the aisle, ready for anything. Inside the cockpit, Captain Bryce Harrington stared at the instrument panel as though searching for flaws in a perfect face. Every reading remained stable. Every gauge within range. Nothing justified the sensation tightening his chest. Stevens checked the system logs again. "Captain, we've had no alerts. Pressure is stable, turbine output is normal, weather is clear." Bryce's jaw flexed. He didn't look away from the horizon. "Stevens, have you ever had a feeling you couldn't ignore, even when the data contradicted it?" Stevens paused. "Only once." Bryce turned toward him slightly. "What happened?" Stevens swallowed. "I listened to it, and I was glad I did." Bryce absorbed that. The quiet between them deepened. Then Bryce shifted forward, adjusting the throttle just slightly, as though preparing for something he couldn't yet name. Back in the cabin, Elaine leaned toward Victor. I keep thinking about what you said earlier about assumptions we didn't question. Victor let out a long breath. I'm not proud of it. Elle? Her eyes lowered. When did we become people who stopped seeing others for who they were? Victor hesitated, then answered gently, maybe when we started believing our world didn't include them. Elaine blinked, surprised by the sadness in his voice. Before she could speak again, the aircraft shuddered. This time there was no mistaking it. A crisp, vibrating tremor rippled under the floor and up through the structure of the cabin. Not violent, not enough to alarm a seasoned traveler, but enough to silence every whisper, every movement. Elaine's fingers dug into the armrests. Victor's eyes lifted sharply. Maria froze mid-step, her breath caught. Amara slowly lifted her chin, her expression composed but alert. The lighting overhead flickered once, just once, and then steadied again. In the cockpit, Bryce's hand slammed onto the autopilot disengage switch before the alert even sounded. I felt that, Stephen said, his voice dropping into a deeper register. Check electrical load distribution. Now! Stevens's fingers flew across the console. Reallocating auxiliary power. No faults detected. Battery output normal. All generators online. Bryce's eyes narrowed. What about environmental systems? Climate stable, pressure stable. No anomalies detected. Bryce muttered a quiet sentence to himself, then said out loud, I don't like it. Stevens glanced at him. Should I inform the cabin crew? Not yet. Give me a clear pattern first. Or a warning? Yes, sir. Bryce steadied the aircraft manually, even though autopilot still showed full functionality. His knuckles whitened around the yoke. Inside the cabin. Elaine turned to Victor, her voice thin. Something is wrong. Don't tell me it isn't. Victor inhaled deeply, trying to stay calm. If something was wrong, the captain would... Another tremor. Slight. Brief. Different. Amara closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the vibration. When she opened them again, she looked toward the cockpit door. Her expression wasn't fearful. It was discerning, like someone assembling invisible pieces in her mind. Maria hurried toward the front, keeping her voice low. Ms. Sterling. Should I be worried? Amara looked directly into her eyes. Not worried. Just ready. Maria's breath hitched. Do you know what's happening? Amara didn't answer immediately. Her voice, when it came, was quiet enough to sink into the air rather than rise above it. Sometimes people change, sometimes systems change, and sometimes the truth rises before anyone is ready to name it. Maria stared at her for a beat, unsure how to interpret the words, yet unable to dismiss them. Bryce's voice suddenly came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We're experiencing a minor system irregularity. There is no danger, but I'd like everyone to remain seated with your seatbelts fastened for the time being. Elaine gasped softly. Minor? He said minor. Victor squeezed her hand. It's a precaution. Maria moved quickly to ensure every passenger complied, her steps more rapid than before. She was trained to conceal worry, but even she could not completely hide the urgency now threading through her actions. Amara fastened her seatbelt, her movements controlled and calm. Through the cabin window, the sky remained clear. Calm skies sometimes hid the sharpest truths. Elaine leaned forward slightly, her voice trembling. Victor, what if something happens? Victor looked at her with the kindest seriousness she had seen from him in years. Then we face it. Together. Elaine closed her eyes, the emotion rising behind her ribs, tightening her breath. Another tremor passed under the floor. Smoother this time. Almost like the aircraft shivered. Amara whispered quietly. It's a lining. Maria heard the words as she walked past, turning back toward Amara with widened eyes. What's a lining? Amara met her gaze with a steady calm that felt older than the moment. The truth? Maria felt the words land somewhere deep in her chest. Up front. Bryce steadied the aircraft once more. Stevens's voice broke the silence. Captain, new reading? Bryce's eyes sharpened. What kind of reading? A pause, then Stevens looked up with an expression that chilled the air. Electrical feedback in the cabin camera circuit. And he swallowed. And an interference spike coming from the forward passenger section. Bryce frowned. Interference from where exactly? Row 1. Bryce's head snapped up. He stared at the door to the cabin as though he could see through it. Stevens said quietly, "Should we inform them?" Bryce didn't answer yet, because there was a new truth rising with the morning, and he could feel it settling directly into the center of everything. Something inside that cabin had begun to change the course of the day, and none of them yet understood how profound that change would be. The aircraft eased forward through a stretch of clear sky, yet inside the cabin, everyone felt a weight pressing down. Not a physical heaviness, but something quieter, more human, as if the air itself had become aware of its own stillness. Amara Sterling sat with her hands resting lightly atop her lap. Her breathing was slow, grounded, steady. The faint tremors had passed, but what lingered was a deeper shift, a sense that the invisible threads holding the morning together had tightened. Not dangerously, just meaningfully. Elaine Hawthorne couldn't keep her gaze from drifting toward the cockpit door. Every few seconds. Her fingers tightened around the armrest. Her voice was barely audible when she finally spoke. "Victor, I feel like the captain is hiding something." Victor took a breath. He had noticed it too, but he didn't want panic rising in Elaine's chest. "I think he's trying to understand what's going on before alarming anyone." Elaine lowered her gaze. Her voice trembled slightly. "I don't want to be caught off guard." Victor reached out, covering her hand with his own. "Then we stay aware. That's all we can do." Elaine nodded slowly, though the worry in her eyes didn't leave. In the galley. Maria Evans folded a napkin only to unfold it again, her fingers trembling faintly. She had seen passengers anxious before. She had felt tension mid-flight, but this morning felt different. Something unspoken pulsed just beneath the surface of every breath. She placed the napkin aside and stepped back into the aisle, her voice calm even though her thoughts were racing. "Everyone, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. The captain will update us soon." People nodded, some quietly whispering, some glancing around. But Maria's steps had only one destination. Row 1. Amara lifted her eyes when Maria approached. Maria whispered softly, "It's still only the two of us who feel this, isn't it?" Amara offered a gentle, grounding nod. "For now." Maria exhaled carefully, her anxiety loosening just slightly. Inside the cockpit, Captain Bryce Harrington stared at the interference reading on his monitor with a deep crease between his brows. Stevens scanned the data again, his voice calm but tight. "It's faint. Captain. Not electrical failure, not environmental. More like a feedback disruption up from a device or a signal." Bryce leaned closer. A passenger device. The possibility tasted wrong in his mouth. But it was still a possibility. Stevens adjusted the dial and isolated the waveform. Forward cabin, row 1. It's coming from seat 1C. Bryce's heartbeat skipped. He didn't know why the reading rattled him so deeply. Maybe because tension had already been following him since takeoff. Maybe because seat 1C was where everything began that morning. Or maybe because intuition was louder than data now. Stevens waited for an order. "Captain, should I document this as a security concern?" Bryce froze, just for a breath. Then he shook his head. "Not yet. I'll speak to her myself." Stevens studied him. "Are you sure?" Bryce nodded. "If something's wrong, I want to understand it firsthand." Stevens didn't argue. He simply watched as Bryce unbuckled his harness, straightened his shoulders, and prepared to step into a cabin that held more tension than he fully understood. When Bryce opened the cockpit door, the shift in atmosphere was immediate. Every head turned slightly, even if just in the corners of their eyes. He walked with measured steps, but inside him, a quiet storm brewed. Maria saw him first. Captain. Her voice carried a note he recognized too well-controlled worry. Bryce approached her, keeping his tone professional. I need to speak with the passenger in one seat. Maria hesitated, then nodded. Stepping aside, Bryce moved forward until he reached Amara's row. His breath slowed. His stance stiffened unconsciously, even though he tried to appear composed. Amara looked up at him, calm as sunlight over still water. Captain Harrington? Her voice was gentle, but something in it made him straighten more carefully. Mrs. Sterling. May I have a moment? Victor and Elaine both reacted instantly. Elaine stiffened. Victor leaned forward slightly, his protective instincts rising. Amara didn't move. Of course, Captain. He cleared his throat. We detected an unusual signal originating from this row. Not dangerous, just irregular. I need to confirm that all devices here are functioning normally. Amara nodded but did not look surprised. I understand. Bryce waited, expecting her to reach for a phone or tablet. Instead, she folded her hands gently and said nothing. Elaine's voice broke the silence. Captain, what kind of signal? Bryce turned slightly, maintaining calm. Nothing harmful? Mrs. Hawthorne. I'm just gathering information. Elaine's breathing tightened. So there is something wrong. Victor placed a hand on her arm. Let him speak. Bryce looked back at Amara. If you have a device transmitting signals, I'll need to verify it. Amara's gaze softened. Not with condescension, but with a quiet steadiness that unnerved him far more than any turbulence could. Captain, I assure you I have no device interfering with your systems. Bryce felt something tighten in his chest. Then why is the reading centered on your seat? Her voice stayed serene. Have you considered that your instruments might be detecting something other than electronics? Bryce blinked. The words made no sense, yet they stirred something uncomfortable inside him, as if she had touched a nerve he didn't know he had exposed. Maria stepped closer, sensing the quiet weight between them. Captain. Ms. Sterling has been calm the entire flight. She hasn't used anything since we boarded. Bryce listened, but his gaze didn't leave Amara. I need clarity. That's all. Amara nodded once more, but this time she lifted her hand slightly, her gesture slow and measured. Then sit with me for a moment. The request startled him enough that he hesitated. Elaine stared, eyes wide. Victor leaned back slowly, unsure of what was unfolding. Maria looked between them, heart pounding. Bryce inhaled. I'm on duty, Mrs. Sterling. Amara's eyes warmed. Yes, and right now your duty requires clear understanding. Sit. The calm authority in her voice disarmed him more effectively than any command. After a long moment, Bryce lowered himself into the empty seat beside her. For the first few seconds, neither spoke. The hum of the aircraft seemed louder now, vibrating softly beneath them. Amara waited until she felt his rigid posture soften by the smallest degree. Then she said quietly, Captain Harrington, when you boarded this plane, what were you certain of? He frowned, caught off guard by the question. I'm not sure I understand. You do. Her tone was soft. Certain. Bryce looked down at his hands, avoiding her gaze for the first time. I was certain of procedure, regulation, order. Amara tilted her head gently. And were you certain of the people on board? He swallowed. I believed I was... She watched him carefully. And now, Silence stretched. Elaine leaned in slightly, barely breathing. Maria felt her pulse pounding in her ears. Victor's eyes softened with uncomfortable understanding. Finally, Bryce spoke, his voice a tight whisper. Now I'm not sure of anything. Amara nodded as though she had been waiting for those words. That is the real signal you're detecting, Captain. Not from a device, from yourself. Bryce stared at her, stunned. Her voice deepened with a quiet truth that wrapped itself around every ear in the cabin. You feel the shift because everything you assumed this morning is unraveling. Not out of danger, out of exposure. You're sensing the weight of a truth you didn't expect to face at 35,000 feet. Bryce couldn't breathe for a moment. Amara's final words landed with delicate force. And that truth is me. The cabin went utterly still. Elaine clutched Victor's arm. Maria pressed a hand to her chest. Bryce stared at Amara as if seeing her clearly for the first time. And in that clarity, something inside him cracked open just slightly. The kind of crack that let change slip in. Silence settled over the cabin so completely that even the gentle hum of the aircraft felt distant, like a memory fading into the edges of the moment. Captain Bryce Harrington sat beside Amara Sterling, unable to pull his gaze away from her. Not because of fear, not because of suspicion, but because she had spoken a truth that reverberated through him in a way he had not expected. The truth is me. Her words echoed in him. Not loud, not forceful, but deeply. They sank beneath the layers of training and protocol and quiet biases he had never questioned. For a long moment, he could not find breath enough to speak. Across the aisle? Elaine Hawthorne gripped Victor's arm more tightly than she realized. Her heart thudded in a rhythm that felt too loud for the silence. Something inside her softened and cracked at the same time. She whispered so quietly that only Victor heard her. I think she's right. Victor's chest rose with a slow inhale. He didn't answer, but the look in his eyes said he had been feeling it too. Maria Evans stood a few steps away, watching the captain and Amara with the quiet reverence of someone witnessing a moment she didn't fully understand yet, but knew was significant. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She simply held the space, instinctively sensing its importance. Amara turned slightly toward Bryce, her posture calm, her eyes steady. Captain, you're reacting to a shift inside yourself. Not a system failure, not a threat. Just truth surfacing faster than you expected. Bryce found his voice, though it came out low and slow. Why now? Amara answered without hesitation. Because this flight forced you to see what you normally overlook. His breath shook subtly. She wasn't accusing him. She wasn't lecturing him. She was simply naming the thing he had refused to turn toward. He lowered his gaze to his hands, the fingers trembling slightly. I didn't realize. People rarely do, she replied softly. Not until something interrupts the distance they rely on. He absorbed that, the meaning settling heavily but not painfully, more like a weight he had carried without noticing, suddenly made visible. Elaine swallowed, her voice barely a thread. What does this mean, exactly? Amara shifted her gaze toward her, gentle but unwavering. It means that every person on this plane came aboard with assumptions. Some small, some heavy, some inherited. And something about this morning forced those assumptions into the light. Elaine's eyes shimmered, not with sadness alone, but with something more vulnerable. I didn't want to see myself like that. Amara's expression softened. People rarely want to, but seeing it is how they change. Elaine looked down at her hands, ashamed yet strangely relieved. It was as if she had been holding a tension inside herself for years, and the morning had cracked it open. Victor placed a steady hand on her back. It's all right, Elaine. We're all here now. She nodded, blinking back the heat rising behind her eyes. Bryce finally exhaled, long enough that his shoulders trembled. Mrs. Sterling, Why did the instruments pick up that signal from your seat? Amara answered simply, because your senses were tuned to notice me before your mind admitted it. Machines follow the energy of their operator. They reflect what you feel. Bryce stared at her, breathing slowly. Machines reflect the person controlling them. Yes, He leaned back in the seat, letting the words echo through him. Suddenly, the interference reading didn't feel technical at all. It felt symbolic. Human. Maria finally stepped forward, quietly breaking the stillness. Captain, is everything stable? Bryce looked up at her, his voice steadier now. Yes, the aircraft is fully stable. We're in no danger. Elaine released a breath she had been holding for minutes. Victor leaned back, letting the reassurance settle into his body. Maria nodded slowly, relief loosening her shoulders. But when she turned toward Amara again, her voice was softer. Ms. Sterling, how did you know that was what he needed to hear? Amara answered with a small, gentle smile. Because he didn't need data. He needed clarity. Maria held her gaze for a moment, moved by something she couldn't quite name. Then she returned to her duties, though she walked differently now, more open, more aware. Bryce looked toward the cockpit, then back at Amara. I should return to my controls. Amara nodded. Then take what you've learned with you. He stood slowly, feeling the difference in the air around him, as though the space itself had shifted shape. When he turned to leave, he paused. Mrs. Sterling. Amara lifted her eyes. Thank you. She responded with quiet warmth. You're welcome, Captain. That simple exchange felt like a hinge turning in the middle of the cabin. A subtle moment, but profound. Bryce walked back toward the cockpit with new intention in his stride. When he closed the door behind him, Stevens immediately looked up. Everything all right, sir? Bryce paused. His voice held a new clarity. Yes, everything is as it should be. Stevens frowned slightly. So the interference was not technical. Bryce said, just human. Stevens didn't fully understand, but he nodded respectfully. Bryce returned to his seat, his mind quieter now. Not calm exactly, but clearer. In the cabin, Maria checked on the passengers again. Elaine looked up when she passed by. Maria. Maria stopped. Yes, Mrs. Hawthorne? Elaine's voice was small, but honest. I'm not proud of how I behaved earlier. Maria's expression softened. It was a stressful morning. We all react when we feel unsettled. Elaine shook her head. No, this is different. I judge someone without understanding anything about her. Maria lowered herself slightly, meeting her at eye level. It matters that you see it now. Elaine's eyes glistened. It hurts to see it. Growth usually does. Maria answered softly. Elaine inhaled shakily and nodded. Amara watched from her seat, not intruding, not pushing, but witnessing. The cabin was slowly unclenching itself. People were letting go of layers they didn't know they had carried. Victor leaned toward Elaine. You're trying. That's enough for today. Elaine leaned her head against his shoulder for the first time in years. Not out of weakness, but out of release. The aircraft continued forward, steady and quiet. Outside, the sky stretched wide and bright, untouched by the human truths unfolding beneath its vastness. Amara closed her eyes for a moment, exhaling gently. One more layer had shifted, one more mind had opened, and the truth was still rising. The sky outside began to shift from its cool mid-morning clarity into a warmer tone, the kind that signaled they were gradually descending from the quiet stillness of cruising altitude. But inside the cabin, the sense of descent felt deeper, as if something within each person had been moving downward too, settling into a place of truth they could no longer ignore. Amara Sterling rested her hands lightly along the armrests, Her posture remained calm, her breath steady. But there was a softness in her expression now, the kind that appeared only when a long internal process finally reached a resting point. She wasn't triumphant. She wasn't relieved. She was simply present, carrying the weight of the morning with a composed grace. Elaine Hawthorne had stopped gripping the armrests. Instead, her hands lay open in her lap, palms loose, fingers relaxed. She had not expected such a subtle change to feel so profound, almost as if something inside her had unclenched after years of holding tight. She glanced toward Amara again, not with suspicion, not with fear, but with something almost tender. Victor watched her quietly, noticing the tiny shifts. The woman beside him felt different, not fully changed, not erased of bias or discomfort, but open, more than she had been in years. He rubbed her shoulder gently and whispered, "You did well today." Elle, Elaine's voice caught slightly. "I didn't do anything." Victor smiled. Sometimes the hardest thing is to see yourself clearly. Elaine blinked slowly, feeling that truth land deeper than she expected. In the front of the aircraft, the cockpit door opened again. When Captain Bryce Harrington stepped out, his demeanor held an unmistakable steadiness. His steps were slower, more deliberate. His face was calm, but not in the rigid professional way from earlier. This calmness came from humility and from understanding. Maria Evans noticed immediately and straightened, anticipation stirring in her chest. "Captain." He nodded calmly. "I'll address the cabin in a moment. I just need to say one thing first." Maria tilted her head slightly, sensing the significance. "Of course." Bryce walked toward row one, not with the sternness of a man enforcing protocol, not with the hesitance of a man approaching a problem he didn't understand. He walked as someone ready to acknowledge the thing he had been avoiding. When he reached Amara, he stopped, his breathing settling into a slow rhythm. "Mrs. Sterling." Amara lifted her eyes to him. "Captain." For a long moment, he simply stood there, searching for words he had never been trained to use, words that carried weight but no defensiveness, words that required no rank. Finally he spoke, his voice gentle. "I need to apologize." The cabin fell absolutely silent. Even the hum of the engines felt distant. Bryce continued, "This morning, I thought I was enforcing protocol. I thought I was making the flight safe. But the truth is, I reacted to you in a way I didn't fully understand. And the person I became in that moment is not the man I want to be." Elaine closed her eyes, the confession hitting a part of her she wasn't ready for. Victor's jaw tightened, but in a way that showed admiration rather than anger. Maria pressed her fingertips to her lips, feeling emotion rise. Bryce lowered his head slightly. "You deserved respect from the moment you stepped on this plane. You weren't given that. Not by me. And I'm sorry." Amara didn't rush to respond. She let the apology settle, let the honesty breathe. Then she spoke with the soft depth that had guided every moment of truth that morning. "Captain Harrington, what you're doing right now matters more than you know." Bryce inhaled shakily. "I want to be better. That's all." Amara nodded, her expression warm and full of grace. "You already started." He swallowed hard, and for the first time since takeoff, he felt the tightness in his chest ease. When he finally stepped back, it was not an act of retreat, but of release. Maria approached quietly. "Captain, the passengers will feel calmer if they hear from you." Bryce nodded. "You're right." He returned to the front, pausing before he lifted the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We'll begin our descent shortly. I'd like to reassure you that the aircraft is stable and our arrival is on schedule. It's been a unique morning, and I want to thank you all for your patience and calm. We'll be touching down soon." His voice carried a subtle warmth that had been missing before, a humanity threaded through the professionalism. When he placed the microphone down, he took one steadying breath before re-entering the cockpit. Stevens glanced at him, eyebrows raised. "Everything all right out there?" Bryce nodded with quiet conviction. "Better now." The descent continued smoothly. The engines shifted pitch, the cabin lights adjusted to the changing altitude, and faint outlines of the terrain below began to take shape. Maria made her final pass through the aisle, ensuring everyone was buckled. But when she reached the Hawthorns, something unexpected happened. Elaine reached out and lightly touched Maria's hand. "Thank you." Maria blinked. "For what? For being patient with me earlier." Maria's expression softened. "We all have moments we wish we handled differently. What matters is how we move forward." Elaine nodded, her throat tightening. She had not felt this exposed in years, yet it felt strangely relieving. Victor squeezed her hand. "You're doing all right." L. As Maria moved toward row 1, Amara looked up at her. "Everything is ending the way it should." Maria. Maria's heart flickered with emotion. "I believe you." Outside the window, clouds parted to reveal the stretch of runway waiting below, sunlight glinting off its surface. The aircraft lowered gently, its descent smooth and controlled. Inside, the cabin was quieter than ever. Not tense, not fearful, just quietly reflective, as though everyone felt the weight of the journey beyond the miles traveled. The wheels touched the ground with a soft, confident thrum. A few passengers exhaled audibly. Victor squeezed Elaine's hand again, steadying her. Maria braced lightly, then relaxed when she felt the landing smooth out. Amara closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply. The flight was over, but the truth awakened in the air today would not fade with the engines. As they taxied toward the private hangar, something unexpected happened. Elaine looked across the aisle at Amara, not with lingering discomfort, not with avoidance, but with genuine courage. "Mrs. Sterling." Amara opened her eyes and met her gaze. "Yes, I judged you, before I knew anything about you, and I'm ashamed of that." Amara listened quietly, giving her time. Elaine swallowed hard. "But you showed more grace today than I've shown anyone in years. And I needed you to know. I'm sorry. Truly." Amara's expression warmed with something deep and kind. "Thank you for saying that." Elaine. Elaine let out a trembling exhale, tears shining at the corners of her eyes. Amara added softly, "Today was hard, but you chose to see yourself honestly. That takes strength." Elaine lowered her head as emotional relief washed over her. When the engines powered down at the hangar, the cabin lights brightened slightly. Maria moved to open the main door, and Bryce returned once more, standing at the front as passengers gathered their belongings. But before anyone could move toward the aisle, he spoke. "For what it's worth, I won't forget today." His words echoed softly through the cabin. Victor nodded in return. Elaine lifted her gaze, gratitude shining through the remnants of humility. Maria felt her chest tighten with quiet pride. Amara stood slowly, smoothing her jacket with a graceful movement. When she stepped into the aisle, she paused beside Bryce. "Thank you for listening." He nodded. "And thank you for speaking." Their exchange held no bitterness, only mutual recognition. As Amara began walking toward the exit, a quiet energy seemed to follow her, not of authority, not of status, but of presence. The kind of presence that changes a room simply by being in it. When she stepped out into the open air, sunlight washed over her face. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the warmth settle on her skin. Another moment. Another truth. Another quiet victory. Not for power, not for praise, but for humanity. And for the people on that plane. The landing marked more than the end of a flight. It marked the beginning of something better. The story of Amara Sterling is not just about discrimination or misunderstanding. It also reminds us of an old but ever true lesson: people often judge others by their appearance before listening to the truth inside. The sad thing is that sometimes we ourselves carry those unconscious judgments. But this story also opens up a beautiful hope everyone can change. Elaine opens up, admits mistakes. Captain Bryce learns to look back. Maria keeps herself kind even when everyone around her falters. These things prove that maturity does not come from never making mistakes, but from daring to correct them. And Amara, with calmness and kindness, reminds us that true strength lies not in speaking loudly to prove ourselves, but in remaining strong when we are misjudged. Life is often like a flight. We cannot control the wind, but we can hold our own steering wheel. If each of us knew how to look at each other with respect first, the world would be much gentler. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this humane story. If Amara's journey touches you, gives you hope, or makes you think differently about life, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to help spread kind stories to more people. See you again in the next journeys, where each story brings a little healing, a little truth, and a lot of humanity.